Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar, Parenting Atypical Kids, Caring for Yourself, Caring for Your Child. My name is Zoë Kessler and I'll be your host this evening on behalf of psychcentral.com. Before we introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to remind you that you will be able to access the complete webinar online at Psych Central's YouTube channel a little later this week. And if you haven't already checked it out, Psych Central does have a lot of videos and webinars already on a wide variety of mental health topics with guest speakers from many disciplines. Now, during tonight's webinar, please feel free to ask questions by typing them into the question area on your control panel, and we'll have a little question and answer session after the presentation. We will try to answer everyone's questions, but we'll also do our best to wrap up the session within an hour. My guest tonight is Dr. Rita Eichenstein, a pediatric neuropsychologist and the author of the recently published Not What I Expected: Hope and Help for Parents of Atypical Children. Dr. Eichenstein is going to describe common childhood disorders as well as common phases of the emotional journey that parents themselves encounter as they move towards acceptance of their children, but also of themselves. I'm especially excited about Dr. Eichenstein's presentation. I'll tell you, I've read her book, and as a woman with ADHD who was diagnosed late in life myself, I really couldn't help but think that my family, especially my mom, I think, would have benefited tremendously had we had this resource. There's so much great information, support, tips, and just a way to pave the way towards understanding and acceptance for all of us, and even a way to thrive together as a family. That it was just so wonderful to read the book, and I want to thank Dr. Eichenstein for writing it and putting it out there. It's such a great, fresh, new resource. So, without further ado, let's say hello to Dr. Eichenstein. Are you there?
Yes, I am, Zoe.
Super. Okay, so while I ask you a question here about your title, just to get started, I admit that I don't know if this is a I live in Canada kind of thing or what, but I don't know what a pediatric neuropsychologist is. Could you briefly let us know what that is?
Of course, and thank you for having me on Psych Central. This is an honor and a pleasure. A pediatric neuropsychologist is primarily a psychologist, a PhD, clinical psychologist, and so I am trying to get to my PowerPoint, actually, and there we go. With postdoctoral training in the developing brain, so what happens is in psychology school for clinical psychology, where we study all of the mental health and mental illness issues and treatments, then there remains the option of taking postdoctoral studies to study the brain, either the developing brain or the deteriorating or both, and I chose to stay with children. And as you'll see from my talk, that's what I've devoted my professional life to, is testing and evaluating and diagnosing children with a variety of disorders.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Can you see the screen?
We can. Yep. Beautiful.
All right. Beautiful. So thank you. The talk today is called Parenting Atypical Kids, Caring for Yourself, Caring for Your Child. And as you've just heard, I'm a psychologist and a pediatric neuropsychologist, and I also wrote the book, Not What I Expected: Help and Hope for Parents of Atypical Children. In my clinical practice here in Los Angeles, I conduct neuropsychological and educational assessments for school-age kids, and that ranges from age 4 all the way into the young adult age range. And I'm considered a diagnostic expert, working with pediatricians, private and public schools, as well as universities around the country. So you might wonder why, if I've been studying the developing brain and have worked with children of all ages for over 20 years, why would I then go on to write a book and focus about parents? Well, I will be explaining this unusual turn of events as we proceed through this webinar. So I'll be sharing today 3 important topics. Who are atypical kids and why do I use that term? What does that mean for parents as well as professionals who work with kids? Why are parents so important to study and understand? And what happens inside the brain of parents? And what can parents and professionals do? So who is an atypical child and why do I use that term? Why don't I use special needs, learning disabled, handicapped? So it's roughly estimated that 1 out of 6 children will encounter some type of difference in their developmental presentation as they grow. If not more than that. Statistics are hard to come by, but the more statisticians look at the numbers, the more the numbers keep growing. So what I have come to realize, as well as many neuroscientists, is that most definitively to be human is to be neurodiverse. Far from being a mutation, the world of neuroscience is coming to accept that neurodiversity is common. And as a society in general, we're starting to understand that there are lots of positive aspects to so many presentations that are called disorders. And make no mistake about it, this planet needs all kinds of minds, and many of the greatest movers and shakers on earth were once atypical children. To be atypical is part of the human race. However, for our purposes, I've developed this umbrella term for many of these diagnoses. And I'll just go through them briefly. ADD, ADHD is probably the fastest growing. Well, you can't say they're all quickly growing, but it's been estimated that up to 14% of the population has a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. Autism spectrum disorder, the number keeps increasing. My most recent number I've heard was 1 in 68, and just recently I heard 1 in 55. Dyslexia, Sally Shaywitz, Dr. Sally Shaywitz over at Yale, who is a dyslexia specialist, has estimated, her estimate is 1 in 5 students have a type of dyslexic presentation. There's a variety of learning disabilities. There's speech and language disorders, coordination disorders, behavior disorders, mood disorders. There's a concept called twice exceptional, medical diseases, genetic disorders, highly gifted, and obsessive compulsive disorders, tic disorders, Tourette's. In addition, there is a category of kids that I've coined as the in-betweeners. And let's take a look at that group. Because sometimes kids don't get a diagnosis, even though they're difficult, different, quirky, or their parents don't know what to do with them. And there's all kinds of terms that are being floated around society that aren't found in the diagnostic textbooks. And for diagnosis purposes, the 2 main bodies are the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, or the ICD-9, soon to be 10. And a lot of these disorders are not in those books. Now, from the standard medical community, we know that these issues exist. Some of them you will find in these books, some of these you won't. And they're not necessarily diagnostic per se, but they do exist. And while research continues to explore and refine some of these conditions, clearly these are a problem, but they tend to lead to dubious forms of treatment which are not necessarily proven effective. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So why did I write a book about parents of all things? After all, I've trained and worked my whole adult life with children. I love children. I love their energy, their optimism. And to work with kids as I do on a daily basis gives me faith in the universe and in the future of our society. And so I developed a practice specializing in the assessment of children. But along the way, I realized something. There is a missing link here, and that missing link is the adult sitting in the room. It's the parent. And what we know about child development is that parents are a critical and what I discovered to be an overlooked important component of raising this child to be the most successful person they can be. So what would happen to me is that I would hand reports over to the parents after spending many, many hours with their child, observing and testing and sometimes making school observations and often talking to all the different professionals working with the child. And I would spend hours talking to the parent about the child. And then I would hand them the report and they would say, "Thank you very much," and shut the door. And I would think, what is going to happen next? How do parents cope with this news? How are they going to have the emotional resources to put together a treatment plan? And I started to wonder, who is helping parents? And so I didn't set out to write a book. I started to look for a book, an article, or a particular paradigm in research that would give me tools to work with parents to ensure that each child that I would evaluate would continue to get the best treatment possible. And I discovered something unbelievable along the way of my research. That important period of a person's life, the stage called parenthood, it hasn't been studied. In fact, it turns out that after all these years, since Freud, about 150 years or so, parents haven't been given that much attention. Now, you might think that along the way, surely, the changes that parents go through, or maybe the emotional needs of parents, might be taught and investigated. Or maybe there's a body of research about how parents' brain change as a result of having a child, let alone an atypical child, which we'll talk about. Or maybe there's a course that teach professionals who are going to be working with children about parents. Well, you'd be wrong if you thought that, because to date, there really isn't anything out there that helps professionals learn about parents. Now, this isn't parenting. There are thousands of books about parenting. We know how to parent children. We know about attachment theory. We know how to raise an ADD child. We know how to raise an anxiety-free child. We even know how to raise a gluten-free child. But what we don't know is how parents can cope with their feelings about having a child who isn't in the what to expect books. And what I discovered about this huge gap is that parents' brains are unique. When an adult becomes a parent, whether that adult is male or female, hetero as well as gay, biological or adoptive, there are distinct brain, hormonal, and chemical changes in the parent's body. Some of these changes are permanent. In the expectant stage and for at least a few years after, surges of oxytocin, prolactin, and vasopressin combine to make parents into those loving, hovering, and protective people who are quite different from their non-parent counterparts. And I've asked roomfuls of parents to raise their hand if they feel that their friends who are single or child-free have the same brain that they have, and I get chuckles in return and no hands are raised, because parents know instinctively that the process that they have gone through in having children create brain changes, even though they don't realize that these are brain changes. And so this is wired in our DNA. We know from research, and this is from animal research on mammals, that once a mother, or if they share the parenting, has exhibited elevated levels of maternal behavior, these maternal abilities remain permanently encoded in the nervous system. This is called lifelong emotional learning. Not only do the hormones and neurotransmitters create a different brain, but parts of the brain change. And so again, from animal research, we learned that parenthood makes parents more courageous and have stronger memories. Not in terms of remembering where your car keys are, we know that's an issue, but in terms of remembering where the best food for your child or the best shelter, and these are animal studies, so that's what they looked for. More from animal research, we know that abundantly licked rat pups, that's the term, grow up to be less anxious, more resistant to stress, and more capable of exhibiting adaptive behaviors throughout their life. And so that makes well-loved pups more resilient. Well, that's wonderful for those rat pups, and it's wonderful for children who are well raised. But my question is, who takes care of parents? How do we ensure that the people in charge of raising the future leaders of our society are going to be successful? And here is where the research stops cold. Most importantly, what about the kids who need so much care that it becomes out of the norm? So perhaps it's because we're living longer, or because the amount of what we call atypical children are increasing, or we demand a higher quality of life, or child raising has become so much more stressful. But whatever has been built into our mammalian DNA hormonal system doesn't continue to serve parents well when children are atypical. It's just not enough. And so here is where the research stops, but my research began. So I needed to know, how are we going to be able to support parents of atypical children, because this is a very increasing population, and we need these kids well taken care of. They are going to be our future movers and shakers in this world, the out-of-the-box thinkers, the problem solvers, the innovators. That's where they come from. They come from this atypical population. Now, when a parent finds out or suspects that their child is unique, we are going to get there. Here's what happens, what we expect when we're expecting in general. This is the expectant parent brain. It's wired into our DNA to expect a perfect angel. Nothing about parenting is logical, at least in the beginning. And we imagine an idealized image of who our child is going to be. And in my book, I write about the chapter, What We Expect When We Are Expecting. And I talk about, my vignette is someone that I gave the name Emily, the mom I wrote about, who imagined having a little girl who would be calm and sensitive like herself, outgoing but also creative, a good student, a responsible little girl. Well, what happened to Emily actually happens to most parents as that very real child emerges into life. And surprise, it was a he. And he was very different than Emily expected, because no child really matches the idealized child in our fantasies. No one is perfect, and certainly children aren't either. Of course, we know logically in the rational parts of our brain that no one is perfect, but somehow parents have different expectations for their children. And nothing about parenting is logical, really. The optimism and joy of expectation is part, again, of our hormonal wiring system, our expectation system, where the cortisol system is low. In other words, our stress response is lowered. Our oxytocin, which is the love chemical, is pumping at full surge. Vasopressin is the male chemical that creates a sense of vigilance and protection for their young. And in males, they found that testosterone is even lowered in this stage, so they become much more nurturing and much more akin to the female partner. So what happens to parents when the idealized child does not happen to be matching their expectations? What happens when, as parents discover that their child might have issues that are unexpected or unwelcome, is that they go through a myriad of feelings and emotional states. Coping with loss. It's a loss of something they never really had in the first place, but it certainly did exist in their imaginations, the ideal child. And what happens after that fall from grace, how it impacts your emotional system, your spouse's system, and the emotional resilience of all family members determines the future well-being of an atypical child. So here's what happens inside the parent's brain when they worry and anticipate differences or medical issues. So first of all, the limbic system is activated, highly activated. The limbic system is your emotional brain, primarily the amygdala, where it becomes very aroused and you become more emotional. The prefrontal cortex, which is the rational part of the brain, it fights for rational planning, but it is not always successful in overcoming your emotions. So there's always a fight going on between your reasoning brain and your emotional brain. Then there's the lower cortex, which is sometimes called the reptilian brain. These are your survival instincts that regulate body regulation. So as your cortisol surges, you may have heart palpitations. You may be breathing heavier. Your heart may be beating heavier. You may experience some shutdown of your autonomic nervous system a little bit where you sort of freeze, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But overwhelmingly, you have anxiety, fear, and threat to safety. And again, back to evolutionary psychology, we are wired to go into a highly aroused state when you fear that something is amiss with your young. And as I said, stress floods the brain with cortisol, and you are in a state of trauma. Now, trauma takes many courses. It could be trauma with a large T or trauma with a small t. And I have found in my experience that it's sort of irrelevant what type of diagnosis we're talking about, because I've seen parents react very strongly and very emotionally to what I consider to be a less life-threatening diagnosis, such as ADD or ADHD, and respond with more resilience and pluckiness to a more impactful diagnosis. And so it's hard to predict based on the diagnosis how parents are going to react. But one thing is for sure, we are all wired this way. These are actually normal reactions. And I want to reassure parents who are experiencing these feelings that your feelings are entirely normal. You're wired to protect your babies, and this is how your body and your brain have worked together over centuries of evolution to create a survival pattern that ensures the perpetuation of the species. So you are very normal. It's not comfortable, and I'm going to give you some techniques to overcome this. But first, what I would like to do is to look at some of the emotional phases that I have come to see that parents can be going through when you're going through this kind of emotional journey, when you find out that something is indeed amiss with your child and he or she meets some sort of developmental atypicality that rocks your boat. Now, I do accept that hearing a diagnosis, or sometimes a lack of diagnosis, but encountering difficulty, can rock your world. And here are the different emotional phases that you can expect if you get the news. Now, I want to say that not all parents will go through these, and they're not necessarily in linear order, but I'm going to go through them now, and then we'll go through them in detail in a few minutes. So the first response is denial or retreat, or also avoidance of the news. The next phase could be anger, aggression, hostility. The next phase is bargaining, solution seeking, this attempt to regulate, to gain a sense of control. Following that could be depression, isolation, and stigma. And following that is active acceptance, how to live a meaningful life, and collaboration with those around you. So let's just go into some of these stages, and I can explain them. They're not necessarily linear, and if a parent listening isn't going through or hasn't experienced these stages, chances are someone around you is, either a spouse or a partner or a mother-in-law perhaps, because atypical is really a family system. It's not just the child that's atypical, it's the whole system. There's reverberations from having a child who's atypical that affects the whole extended family, not just the parent or the parents, but also the siblings can be involved. So the first phase that we were talking about is denial. And there's a little vignette on the screen, which is part of a larger vignette that's in my book. I knew there was something different about Carlo, but my husband kept saying, "You're just being neurotic. He's just fine." Okay, now this was a mom, Allegra, also a made-up name, and my cases are composites. Everyone is confidential. She had a little boy with autism, and she knew in her gut that something was off, and when she would try to share it with her husband, he would push her off. She would also try to share it with her pediatrician, who said, "Let's give him the gift of time." She tried to share it with other people who said, "You know, I think you just have too high expectations." It's something I hear a lot. So denial can be either an individual reaction, like Allegra's husband, or it could be a group reaction. The school, the pediatrician's office, the family members, because no one really wants to look for a child who's atypical, but oftentimes someone knows in their gut that there is. Now, as soon as you suspect that there might be something amiss with your child, or get a confirmation, even if you suspect, you may go into shutdown mode. And this, again, is normal. It's normal to have a shutdown, hibernate reaction. And I call this the deer in headlights effect, where you go into autopilot and you freeze. Parts of you freeze. Your reasoning brain freezes. Your emotional brain freezes. But your body may go through all your automatic. You may be driving carpool just fine, and you may be cooking dinner just fine, and you may be going to work just fine, but it's sort of an autopilot period. And because your brain's language processing center is affected in this kind of trauma, you may not even be able to think of the kinds of questions that you want to ask the doctor or the diagnostician or the school psychologist until 3 a.m. when all of a sudden all the questions come rushing at you and you go, why didn't I say that? Now, denial can last for a minute. You could be in freeze mode, or it could last for a really long time. And denial that lasts for a really long time can really be problematic. There's nothing wrong with my child is the slogan. And staying numb, staying uninvolved, or avoiding the problem can really be problematic. It could be temporary. I think that not staying stuck in the hole of fear and educating yourself can go a long way, or educating your partner or people in your family. Find an expert you trust. This helps parents move out of this system. And don't go running to the internet so fast rather than searching for experts, or if you're going to go to the internet, we'll talk about that in the bargaining phase, what to do. But find an expert you trust, and if you don't like the first one you see, get a second or third opinion. Many parents have fought the diagnosis originally, but to be a parent means there are always new layers to be discovered in your child, and it's not always what you expected. The next stage that some parents can find themselves in is anger and blame, and I call this the roaring mama or papa bear. We are wired to protect our babies and have the image of the mama bear being disturbed from hibernation and her babies are being threatened. And that is what you get when sometimes you will be reactive and feel incredibly angry and hostile at people around you. Dads can be even more reactive at this point. This stage tends to hit men harder sometimes. It's part of the elevated vasopressin testosterone system, that elevated vigilance and protectiveness that surges through that ancient evolutionary wiring of male neurotransmitters. And also there are cultural reasons. Men can feel marginalized in a lot of these meetings. And parents in general can feel marginalized and have loss of control in these meetings. And they say, who are you to diagnose my child? And anger seeks a target. So there's a lot of blaming that goes on in the anger phase. Now, a terrible statistic is that 50% of special needs children are victims of violence. Don't let this be your family. This is a serious problem. Anger has a way of escalating. So if you or someone in your family has anger management problems, this needs to be taken care of because you don't want your child to be blamed. In this phase, parents will blame each other and the rate of divorce escalates among parents of atypical children, especially when they disagree about either the diagnosis or what to do about the diagnosis. And so this can be a very pernicious phase. I counsel parents to boost your tolerance level, eat a high-protein diet, exercise, get enough sleep, pay attention to your caffeine level, but above all, stop and breathe. And here's, at this point in the webinar, I'd like to take you through the first brief healing practice that parents can use when they're feeling like they're about to blow. This was taught to me by Dr. Elijah Goldstein, and it was originally developed by John Kabat-Zinn, who is a leader in the mindfulness meditation movement. It's called the stop technique. And the visual is, imagine that you have your hand on the handle of your child's bedroom door, and you're about to storm in, ready to scream at this child for something that he or she is doing wrong. The first is S, stop what you're doing or what you're about to do. T, take a breath. Take a really good look at what's going on. What's going on inside your body? What's going on inside of your day? What is it that you're really angry about? O is observe. Observe the situation. Observe your child. What is your child really doing? You know, oftentimes if you can just step back, take a breath, and observe your beautiful little child, you'll see him from a different perspective. And ask yourself, is what I'm really about to get angry about worth it? Is there a better way I could do this? And then P is for proceed mindfully. And I've had parents tell me that if they had only heard that technique that morning, when I talked to them, that morning would have gone better. So it's a very easy technique that I hope you can use. The next phase that we're talking about in terms of these emotional phases is the bargaining and seeking solution phase. You know, this is what I call the most human phase of all. Our brains are wired to be solution seeking. We are at our best. Humans are solution seekers. There's a problem, we're going to fix it. The brain is always in vigilant mode. How do we fix? How do we feather our nest, so to speak? How do we create a safe haven? This is how parents are wired, and this is how humans are wired as problem solvers. But parents are particularly wired to create that very cozy cave for their child. And bargaining and seeking solutions can be either an important phase or a very negative phase. Because here's where parents are prone to think that if they just dig deep enough on the internet, they will find perhaps that rare herb that cures autism or a neurotraining program that makes dyslexia disappear. And I found that parents are very vulnerable, especially when their kids have a diagnosis or multiple diagnoses, and especially if they haven't slept in a while. I found that desperate parents will believe anything. Don't be gullible. There are slick websites full of happy children and testimonials that they can cure your child of everything. And as far as I know, nothing cures everything. Do your homework. I propose to find the standard of care that you find in your team and trust a team. You know, there's a statistic that a large degree of people are turning to alternative medicines rather than Western medicine, and that even if they go to their Western doctor, they will look at alternatives such as homeopathy or herbs or what have you. And I think this is very true in the atypical world as well, that parents will, you know, listen to these diagnoses and say, you know, that just doesn't sound right to me. There has to be something else out there. And they're going to turn and do their research, and sometimes not so good research, because this isn't everybody's area of expertise. In fact, most people, it's not their area of expertise. And they could end up spending a lot of money and time on useless solutions. And I counsel parents and say, don't use your kid as a lab rat. If you're going to experiment, don't experiment on your own kid. In my book, however, I do talk about parents who have successfully found different solutions and developed different techniques to cure different disorders that are out there. And there are ways to do this, but it's rarely the parent that just sits on the internet searching for something out there. Assemble a crackerjack team of therapists, teachers, tutors, and doctors to help your child succeed. Try their solutions first. Trust the standard of care. Don't become what I call the at-home amateur scientist, because it's your child's life at stake. And I recognize that bargaining is a very human part of the human experience. And so I'm encouraging you to first trust the standard of care. Now, what happens when we've bargained, we've looked, we've hunted, your kid's diagnosis is not changing anytime soon, and you've been doing what you've been told and you're not seeing a lot of change? Well, The next phase is a difficult phase, and it's called depression or isolation or stigma. Now, I want to tell you, though, that depression is the common cold of the human mental health system. Everyone experiences it at some point in their life, but parents of atypical kids do get hit harder. You're stressed, you're scared, you're wondering, will my kid ever be okay? More importantly, moms tend to blame themselves, and some people consider depression as anger turned inward, and moms should not blame themselves. Depression is common, but it can be alleviated. But I want to say that this is a very common phase, and if you are not a parent of an atypical child or you're not in the depressed phase, feel free to reach out to help parents who are in this phase. Now, there are treatments that, in doing my research, I came across for parents who are experiencing depression. And of course, there's a lot of research on depression and how to cure it. And of course, there are medications that are effective. But I have found that for parents who are in this unique phase of parenting a child who is atypical, they have unique needs, and these unique needs have possibly unique treatments. So I'm going to go through a few with you. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a system of therapy which the research has found it to be exceptionally effective in treating the kind of depression that is situational and that could possibly be affecting parents. And I encourage parents to, this is one thing you can Google, mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy in your area, and you will find practitioners. Or there are apps, but although I don't super recommend apps because I think for parents it's very important to have the human interaction with it. The next thing I want you to consider is something called self-compassion. This is a concept that was developed by Dr. Kristen Neff, who developed a whole way of looking at oneself. And what she says is that we need to give ourselves the same kind of kindness and care that we'd give to a good friend. And the truth about that is that we so often treat ourselves so much worse than we would see a friend, that we would tolerate seeing a dear friend being treated. And the whole awareness that you are deserving of that kind of kindness and compassion that you give to others. And I've developed a self-care menu. It's in my book. And the self-care menu, and the reason I call it a menu, is because you can choose different courses based on how much time or resources that you have. So there's appetizers, there's main courses, there's desserts. And depending on what you have and how to take advantage of these courses, you can create your own menu for what would do it for you. Because parents have different needs and different joys and different ways of expressing themselves. The next issue is support groups and company of friends. Support groups can be very helpful. It does not have to be exactly the identical type of diagnosis. Some diagnoses are rare. And but just being in the company of people who also have atypical children can be very supportive. And here's where your friends can dig you out. Respite care. Many communities with regional center or with your school district, you are entitled to some respite care. And if you can't hire a babysitter or get some time away, respite care can be provided, but take a break periodically. Find out who you were. And most importantly, date nights and intimacy. Intimacy is a very important part of the adult life cycle, and just because you're a parent does not mean that that part of your life should be ignored. and it's a very important part, and in my book I talk about how to rediscover and reclaim that. So reclaiming yourself as a person, or at least reminding yourself periodically who you are, who you were, BD, before diagnosis. You can bring it into the AD life after diagnosis. Now, the next phase and the final phase is what I call active acceptance, creating a meaningful life. This phase does not come without work. It isn't easy to accept your new reality, especially if it isn't the one that you expected or chose for yourself. But I want to say a few things. First of all, we all know about post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of trauma and the resulting possibility, but there's also post-traumatic growth. It's a concept that positive changes tend to follow a crisis and that you can experience a very active, full life with a lot of growth that would not have happened were it not due to your child's showing you a new path that you wouldn't have necessarily chosen. People have found that parents of atypical children have increased compassion for others or have more appreciation for what you have. There's also the concept of staying open to your own flow and creating a meaningful life. And what that means for different people are different things. Some parents choose to become an advocate for their child's condition and help other parents deal with the news. There's research in positive psychology that's found that helping others, it greatly increases your sense of well-being, and this is really an important component of active acceptance. Even while it doesn't mean you're pleased about your kid's condition. But another part of creating a meaningful life may not necessarily for you have to do with your child's condition. You may choose to go on and do something else. So I want to remind parents that you have brain changes that have made you more courageous, more energized, and more focused than parents who did not have atypical children. And with that courage and energy, you now have tools that you did not have earlier in the non-parenting state to go on and create a meaningful life for yourself, because our lifespans are much longer than they were in previous times. And that means that there's so many more possibilities that go on to create more generativity and more feelings of self-effectiveness that happen even after child rearing. It's also important to consider that because oftentimes parents become somewhat crushed under the feeling of being Timmy's mother or parenting, and when that stage of life becomes less oppressive or less permanent in your life, parents are sometimes at a loss. What do I do next? This has taken up all my time. So in closing, I want to share with you a vignette from my book out of the positive active acceptance phase. This was a mom who, even though her child was still young, she found that a nice surprise. And I'll read this to you. Today was the day that I was dreading, yet another IEP meeting. Another time the teachers and principal would look at me and tell me that everything that was wrong with my child. I was armed and prepared, but inside I was shaking from nervousness. Help me, God, I said to myself. I can't go through another meeting. But what a surprise I got. They told me that my child had been exited out of all his services and he didn't need them anymore. Things that made me cry. He was observed on the playground, engaged in conversation with peers. He followed the rules of the game. He engaged in conversation and made eye contact. And he scored intellectually in some subjects at freshman college level. And he's 10. When he was diagnosed at age 4, I read everything on the internet and felt so hopeless about him ever functioning in normal society. Love, faith, perseverance, belief, and stubbornness can change everything. Nothing is finalized, and the thought of middle school terrifies me. But just for today, I celebrate in proving wrong those people who said he would never interact, socialize, or be able to survive in a mainstream class. We are so proud of our child. And so I want to conclude and say the most important place that parents will find the strength to go forward is really in that relationship with your child. Your child has already been your teacher, your guide, your inspiration, and you will be the person to show your child how to love, how to cope, how to cry, struggle, celebrate, and how to live a beautiful but imperfect life. Have the courage to keep moving forward. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Dr. Eichenstein?
Yep, I can.
Oh, that's great. I love how you wrap that up. And I do remember as a child wishing that the dialogue between my mom and I, who was raising me, she was home during the day, could have been more clear, you know, because if we could have only communicated, if I could only have communicated and she could have heard how I was feeling and what I was thinking as a child with ADHD, you know, I think the dialogue between the two smooths over some of the problems. Can you speak to that a bit?
Oh, absolutely. You know, children who are atypical process information atypically, and parents' expectations need to be adjusted to match who your child is, not who you think they should be. And so really observing the child and coming down to their level, so to speak. You know, kids are asymmetrical. They're like puppies with large paws and long spindly legs, and they're tripping all over each other, and we tend to think those puppies are really cute. But why don't parents think their kids are cute when they do these atypical things? It's a whole expectation syndrome. And, you know, it's really sad, I think, if parents just take a look at their child and say, wow, aren't they cute? And let's talk and encourage their child, have dialogue and have special time together without those expectations.
Well, I mean, with all due respect, I don't know, I'm just going to jump in here, and I would like to invite everyone who's online with us right now to go ahead and send your questions in at this point. I don't want to hog the time that we have left, which is only, unfortunately, about 5 minutes, but please do send your questions in. But getting back to this thinking your child is cute, when your child is having a tantrum or talking back to you or indulging in some kind of outrageous behavior, how do you, I mean, I loved that whole thing about the stop approach. How do you wrap your head around that to come back to the place where you appreciate the charming cuteness in your child? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And, you know, no one said this is easy. I think that, you know, behavior management techniques are really important. It's not enough just to think your kid is cute and to lower your expectations. I mean, obviously parents are not only role models in coping, but parents are teachers, and teaching the child how to behave and what's appropriate and not appropriate is even more difficult with atypical kids. So there's no easy answer for your question. I mean, I wish there was, but I do feel that if we could cut through some of that anger and depression and the hopelessness, parents would find much more easier to communicate with their child.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so then when you say atypical parenting, when you say raising an atypical child requires atypical parenting, then what part of parenting is the atypical part, would you say?
That's such a good question. You know, we know all about attachment and that to create a securely attached child, there's things you need to do, create eye contact and skin-to-skin bonding and create communication and help the child verbalize. But with atypical kids, a lot of that just flies out the window. I mean, think about eye contact, you know. kids on the autism spectrum have a great deal of difficulty with eye contact, and so many kids with ADD also do. And so that goes out the window. And parents have to work much harder at creating the attachment bond. And they don't have the benefit of the guidebook that's out there, like how to raise an atypical kid. You know, they don't. It's not in the books. They have to get down to the kids level and really work at how can I bond with this child? Bonding is going to be a little harder.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And so here's a question from one of our webinar participants. How do you handle unwanted advice from parents of typical children who assume they are better parents because their child is quote unquote typical?
Oh, such a good question. I get asked this a lot, actually, and it's painful. It is painful. It's part of the syndrome that sends parents back into that isolation and depression place. And, you know, what I say is if your child has a diagnosis, I say be an advocate for this diagnosis and say, I'm sorry, my child has ADD. It's very different than a typical child. And you can explain a little bit about what, you know, some issues that this child may have, because I think that educating the child is, educating the public is very important, and become an advocate for your child's disability or diagnosis.
That's a great answer, and I was just thinking, you know, one would have to already, that would presuppose that you can manage your own emotions, you know, well enough to be and to get to the point where you can be an advocate and educate others. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to just reacting or getting your back up or feeling insulted or stigmatized or all. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, exactly, and that's why it's so hard. And the primary person that's really suffering in this whole thing is the parents, much more than the child, because the child, this is their whole life. They don't know differently. But it's the parent that has to deal with all the social stigma and the misinformation out there.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think you did go through this a little bit. How do parents find help and support for themselves? You mentioned a few places, but is there a best place to get it, or is that sort of individual for individual parents? I mean, I've got your book now, thank goodness. I guess the book can be found in bookstores and online, presumably?
Yes, correct. Correct. At the, you know, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, you know, all the main places. But this is a new territory, and seeking help, whether you go to, you know, parents have told me that they would never go to someone for mental health that didn't have children themselves, and the reason is because unless you experienced it, how can you be empathic? And that really says something to our culture of mental health professionals that actually haven't been trained to work with parents and don't understand the parenting emotions. But I do encourage parents to go seek as much support as they can, and support groups. It can be a great place to start.
What kind of support groups? Are there parenting support groups specifically for this topic, like atypical children, or what kind of?
No, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think you're going to find support groups for atypical children out on the internet. I think that you need to hone in a little more and look for either your child's diagnosis support group, so support groups for parents of children with ADD, or support group for children on the autism spectrum. And even if your child does not have a diagnosis, but they have symptoms of a diagnosis, these can be very helpful.
Okay. Okay, and I'm aware that, oh, it's already 8 o'clock. Darn. I guess I wanted to wrap up with asking you one more quick question, if you don't mind. How does a parent of an atypical child get to a point, what is your best advice for getting to acceptance of this new reality, the one that was not expected?
Well, that's a big question. You're going to have to read my book to get through all of that, but I feel like parents need to trust their gut, take really good care of themselves, continue to work on compassion for themselves as well as their child, and just reach out for resources around them. You know, I always say that if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes an army to raise an atypical child. The parent is the commander-in-chief, so build your army.
Oh, that's
build your
perfect.
army now.
That is perfect. Okay. Well, I am just so thrilled that you could take the time out of, I know you have a really busy schedule now, especially with the book being recently published. So thank you so, so much for taking this time, you know, to prepare and to join us tonight and to give us this wonderful presentation, which I will remind everybody that they can look at and really sink into it again later in the week on the replay at Psych Central's YouTube channel. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended live tonight, and also to those of you who are listening to the replay who couldn't be with us this evening. Thanks for coming back and checking it out. I'd like to thank Psych Central for hosting, and of course, once again, our very special guest, presenter, author, and pediatric neuropsychologist, Dr. Rita Eichenstein. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And on behalf of PsychCentral.com and me, Zoë Kessler, thanks for joining us, and have a good evening.